Hi everyone, and welcome to the lecture on Phantastes Part One. Phantastes is a 19th century fantasy novel, and we'll be looking at it for the next 2 weeks in terms of how it's really working with theories of fantasy and philosophies of fantasy in the 19th century to try to change the way that fantasy and readers interact. So it will help if you've read through the pages assigned for the novel so that way you can follow along with the different characters and plot points that I'm going to be discussing. I also wanted to acknowledge that this is a difficult text, so don't be frustrated or surprised if you're not understanding everything or if it feels a little strange. That is okay, and in fact almost intentional on the part of the author. So I want you to just grapple with it, wrestle with it, don't let it push you off, but actually try to engage with its difficulty. Phantastes was written by George MacDonald, and he was a contemporary of many other more famous Victorian writers, although he himself has not been as well remembered. He knew Wilkie Collins and John Ruskin, and he was close friends with Lewis Carroll. And in fact, it's considered that he may have been one of the primary reasons why Carroll decided to publish Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. He and his family were able to hear it when it was first written in draft phase and then encouraged Lewis Carroll to put it out for publication. So he is mainly known as a children's author, but he did start out in the church, and he's published sermons, realist literature, and then fantasy literature as well. And that fantasy literature is what he kind of is really known for. If you get into Victorian's children's literature, he's a much more famous figure within Victorian children's literature than within the whole British canon. He is really interested in romantic philosophy, so I want us to take a moment to remember Romanticism starts at the beginning of the 19th century, and Victorianism is the second half, beginning in the 1950s. So he is looking back to the earlier part of the 19th century and still really relying and using romantic philosophy from the British tradition, but also from the German tradition. So he's very interested in subjective ways of knowing and using imagination as a way to perceive truth, not through the rational mind, but through this sort of fantastic, imaginative, aesthetic experience, that it could lead to truth and not necessarily have to have this realistic, rational kind of truth that is more based in empiricism. Because of this interest that he had in fantasy as a way to perceive truth, he's writing Phantastes as a type of experimental fantasy novel. So a novel that is going to be doing something different than what fantasy has normally been doing within British traditions. So again, keep that in mind as you read, that you're reading something that is experimental. So it's going to maybe not be perfect in terms of those expectations that you have as a reader for what fantasy should do, because it's trying to push back on those things. So it is published in 1858, and for some context, Alice's Adventures is published in 1865, so really close together there. And again, thinking about Lewis Carroll and MacDonald kind of being friends and talking about fantasy and talking about these novels that they're writing and having these conversations about what fantasy is doing in 19th century literature. Unfortunately for MacDonald, though, his novel has a really negative critical reception. Unlike Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which is going to go on to become critically acclaimed during its own time and then has, I think, never been out of print since then. It's so popular. MacDonald did not have this great experience. So there's this negative critical reception that people are publishing book reviews saying that they don't really like it that much, and that one of the main reasons is that there's this lack of an allegory, that this is one of the problems that critics identify in the book. And that's why I think for us it's really interesting for us to read this, even though it's a little rough around the edges or a little meandering sometimes, is because it really helps us identify the way that 19th century readers and critics were thinking about what fantasy should be doing in the culture. So how to read fantasy is really central to the reception that it got. It's breaking these traditional expectations, and in doing so, it's telling us a lot about how fantasy was used in the 19th century. One of the reasons that critics didn't really respond well to what MacDonald was doing is because he actually incorporated some German philosophy into the text as well as a German narrative structure. So he modeled it on a Märchen, which is a fairy story that draws on spiritual longing and self-discovery. Those type of fairy tales within the German tradition are not necessarily going to be narratively structured in a way that's really easy and appealing for a reader to understand. So I think I should also note here that Phantastes as a novel, it's technically a fairy story, but it's also much more written for adults. So you can think of it as one of the earliest fantasy novels for adults that's written. Even though children might be interested in reading it, as you go through the text, what you're going to see is much more heavy philosophy that's incorporated that really only adults would have the cultural knowledge to engage with at that time. So this is a fantasy novel, again, where it's breaking some of those boundaries, because who is the audience for fantasy in the 19th century? Well, typically it's been children, and more it's pushed towards children. But then you have this text that's doing something different. It's using a different style than what British readers are really used to seeing, and it's really asking people to get out of their comfort zone. One of the patterns that it also incorporates from a German tradition is the Bildungsroman. So this type of pattern is a story where a hero is developed from child to man. So David Copperfield by Charles Dickens is one of the more famous of the 19th century British tradition. It starts out in childhood, follows him into adulthood. That type of structure was well known to Victorian writers in the 19th century British tradition. That is something they understood. But what MacDonald is going to do is play with some of these conventions. So he's using and incorporating well-known narrative structures and patterns and a well-known mode of fantasy, but he's kind of turning those things on their head a little bit. And that's not always comfortable for readers when a text resists their expectations. So this is one of the reasons that it got very poor critical reviews, is because people didn't really know what to do with it. It was doing something really new and different. Before we get into looking at what those differences are within the text and what is happening in the actual action of the text, I wanted to talk a little bit about these different types of fantasy genres that were circulating during the 19th century, just so that you can then have that vocabulary and that context for what MacDonald is doing. So in the 19th century, a fairy tale is going to have a very set structure. It's extremely rigid in terms of the way that it's going to work and the way that it's going to teach. So usually there's a hero or a heroine that needs some kind of transformation. They're going to undertake a task, or they're going to be granted wishes. Usually it's things appear in threes, so 3 wishes, 3 trials that they have to overcome. There might be 3 fairies that they encounter. And there's usually the use of magic or the supernatural within very restrictive parameters. There's very clearly defined good characters and clearly defined bad characters, and then there's a happy ending and a lesson is taught. Sometimes a very explicit lesson included in like a rhyming couplet at the end of a fairy tale, so that way the lesson would provide that kind of closure, and people would understand why the fantasy had been used. Fairy tales also are a little more on the short side. So you can think of them as short stories, or just very like small snippets of a story, rather than having a full-length novel. Now, a different genre is the romance novel. And this is not romance necessarily meaning a romantic love, but instead it's a tale of adventure or unusual events. So it's romantic in the sense that it's dramatic or unexpected. It has these heroic themes and often medieval motifs, and it's written in long prose. So it doesn't have to be a poem. It doesn't have to have concluding rhymes like some of the fairy tales might have been, but it is more of a novel style. There's also typically a happy ending, and usually this type of novel is going to uphold traditional ideals. So a romance novel then, again, not a romantic comedy novel or a romance in the way that we would think of it today, but more of, you can think of it as knights and ladies and lords and old legends and like King Arthur style, medieval style of writing, that those were types of novels, but they didn't necessarily have to have a moral lesson. They could be told for entertainment. Now, the 19th century Märchen that George MacDonald is deriving his structure from is different than both of these. It's a German literary fairy tale. So you can almost think of it as it's incorporating this fantasy fairy tale type of world, but it's also thinking about heroic ideals, quests, adventures, unusual things happening with a hero or heroine that's looking for some type of spiritual transformation. Often this type of structure had a lot of philosophical ideals explored within the text, like characters would sit down and talk about philosophical points to one another within the text. And in fact, you see some of that in Phantastes. There's imaginative landscapes where everything doesn't necessarily look the same way that it would in the everyday world. And a lot of what happens is that there's an interiority here. The hero's emotional or psychological development is given priority over external events. So again, a looking inside, but within a fantasy world, and where the fantasy world is giving the hero or heroine room to explore philosophical ideals, breaking some boundaries, maybe allowing them to discuss things that were transgressive or not expected. So when MacDonald intentionally chooses the Märchen as his structure, he's going against those expectations of what British readers would really normally think a fairy tale or a romance novel or a heroic exploration should be. So he's setting things up differently than what readers would prefer, perhaps. And for that reason, we have to go with him into the type of structure that he is asking us to inhabit imaginatively. And to do that maybe requires us to push our own boundaries of what pleasure is in the reading experience. Now, for the sake of time, I won't be able to go through every single event in every single chapter. So what I've tried to do is pull out those things that are really most important to the feel of the novel as a whole. And you can also make note of things that maybe were confusing to you or things that you had questions about, and you can talk about those as well to me, either through the Need Help thread or through discussions in the future as well. So to start off with, in chapter 1, we learn Anodos's name, which I feel like is important for us to really pay attention to, because his name actually has that allegorical meaning that we have talked about as being significant for other types of fantasy literature, that it's supposed to have this kind of moral meaning to it to guide people. But in fact, what MacDonald does is subvert this expectation by having his name mean pathless. So it actually doesn't give us any sense of meaning, even though it does have a meaning. So right from the very beginning, MacDonald is doing something a little bit different here. So Anodos as a character then is going to embody this sense of pathlessness. He doesn't really know why he does things. Like, for example, at the end of chapter 2, he's come into fairyland and he's followed this footpath, and he says, "Here I left it without any good reason and with a vague feeling that I ought to have followed its course." There's really no reason for him to leave the path in fairyland. He just kind of follows his instincts or his whims, and he doesn't really understand his purpose of what he's doing in fairyland. Now, in a typical novel, again, romance novel, not romantic comedy, but an adventure novel, usually there would be some kind of quest for a young man that will help him prove his worth and his heroism. Usually there's some kind of clear goal, and there are trials that will help the hero develop wisdom and courage. You can almost think of that quest motif as the very stereotypical old-fashioned one would be that there's a damsel in distress, perhaps being kept in a tower, there's a dragon that has to be defeated, and this knight will come in and destroy the dragon, rescue the girl, happily ever after, right? That's the very stereotypical plot. But what happens for Anodos is that we could almost translate it to meaning plotless, right? That there's going to be this wandering, meanderingness where he is not having a clear goal. And you can compare his progress with the progress of the Red Knight who will appear in the story. And think about the way that the Red Knight is working towards this typical narrative, while Anados is not working towards a typical narrative. So there's this sense where he is kind of wandering and meandering without any real sense of purpose, and embodying this pathlessness that is really central to the text of the novel and the structure of the novel. As he wanders through fairyland, what we begin to see is that he lacks a certain sense of wisdom that could have helped him in fairyland. He hasn't read the right stories, in fact, and he has to learn how to interpret or read fairyland. So this process of trying to read or interpret is really also central to what MacDonald is doing with his concept of fantasy and of fairyland. So at the sort of maybe third or fourth paragraph here of chapter 4, you have, actually a little before that, you have him encounter some fairies who begin laughing at him and mocking him. They say, look at him, look at him. He has begun a story without a beginning, and it will never have any end. So he has this sense of needing structure or needing to tell a story about his time here. And in fact, that's recognized by the other inhabitants of fairyland, that he's supposed to have some kind of story, but he has no beginning. He has no purpose. And you can see as he starts to describe the different things that are happening in fairyland, he talks about the glowworms and beetles, that what's going to happen is his urge to describe or to use language to pin down what is happening begins to really fall apart. He says, but it is no use trying to account for things in fairyland, and one who travels there soon learns to forget the very idea of doing so, and takes everything as it comes, like a child who, being in a chronic condition of wonder, is surprised at nothing. So I want you to really think about this as a strategy of interpreting, because interpretation becomes a central motif of this novel. So his idea, and this is again going back to early 19th century philosophy of Romanticism, that the idea would be that the child has this sense of wonder about everything that's going on and doesn't necessarily try to make meaning out of it, but just experiences it, just looks at everything, thinks about how wonderful it is, thinks about how amazing it is, and just tries to stop making sense of it. I don't know that that's a very necessarily accurate way to describe what happens with children who are trying to process a new world, but this is what Anados is arguing, is that instead of just trying to tell a story or make fairyland into something that has meaning, he's going to just live with the experience of it. Now, this should remind you something in the larger context of our class discussions, that aesthetic experience is being prioritized over trying to interpret and find truth. So this is going to align him much more with Coleridge and with the idea of pleasure being primary. And again, this lines right up with Coleridge's interest in using supernatural and fantasy. And in fact, if you want to go into authorial intention, if that interests you, MacDonald was very much aware of that theory and of where its roots were in German philosophy as well. So he is doing this on purpose. He's not going to give you an easy meaning or even a really strict narrative structure. He's going to say, you know what? You should just sit back, reader. Take everything as it comes. Really look at this world of fantasy that I've created with a sense of wonder, and don't always be trying to interpret everything and try to make it mean something. So we can maybe talk about whether this is a good strategy for reading or not, and really how effective this is in terms of trying to write a novel. That can be one of our questions as we think through the way that we're reacting as modern readers to this novel. Another important moment for us to look at in this first half of the novel is how the story begins with Anados's 21st birthday. Typically, even now, we see that age as signaling adulthood. And for Anados in particular, this is him coming of age or becoming a man. So the journey to fairyland is going to reveal that he is actually not ready to be an adult yet. And you see these kind of moments where he's resisting this idea of sitting back and reading or taking everything as a child with a sense of wonder, because he's saying, I don't want to be a child anymore. I don't want to be called a child. He says, for example, this is in chapter 7, where he has come through the woods and he's had this distressing experience with the alder tree, and he's learned about the ash tree, and he's been taken in by this woman on a farmhouse, and he's encountering her, and she's saying, you can spend the night in my house. So he says, I should have ill endured the day before to be called a boy, but now that the motherly kindness of the word went to my heart, and like a boy indeed, I burst into tears. So the woman has taken him in and says, oh, my poor boy, and he kind of resists this idea of being called a boy, but then he acts like a child again. So he's not quite an adult. He needs comforting. He needs solace. He hasn't really learned anything yet. And he's kind of pitied by her, because she's saying, well, yeah, you are just this sort of child, and you don't know how to interpret the world or how to really inhabit the world. And particularly this becomes clearer in fairyland, but is also probably true for himself in his own reality as well. So we see this other character of the farmer, who's really important here, coming into the farmhouse and providing that contrast with his wife. The farmer is, quote unquote, a man, right? The symbol of the rational, material, realist person that would be the most appropriate gendered ideal of Victorian society. So he himself does not believe in fairy stories. He thinks that those types of stories are just for women and for children, and he doesn't really even communicate with his wife well to trust her or believe her experience. And what you see when Anadas is in the farmhouse is that he's really wavering between these two positions. It really asks us if we want to make the text mean something and move beyond that aesthetic experience of reading. He's really kind of going back and forth between these two positions in Victorian society about how does one act as a child, and how does one become a man, and what does it look like? Well, according to this small episode here, what becoming a man means is leaving behind fantasy, leaving behind fairy stories or things that are unusual or non-rational or even imaginative, and really just choosing the everyday real world that is empirical. So Anadas is kind of going to be pulled between these two positions throughout this novel, and really what you're going to see is that MacDonald is going to actually side more against this farmer as the rationalist man, because within the text, fantasy is real. Fairies are real. Everything that's happening to him, the trees, the ash, the alder, all of these things are actual real things that are happening. So what that means is the farmer is a rationalist, but he's also missing this deeper piece of experience, this deeper spiritual connection and understanding to the imaginative world. So he has outgrown it and thinks that he is too smart for it, but in fact, he has limited and constricted his knowledge to only what he can see. So MacDonald's argument is that actually the farmer is not the best way to grow into being a man, because he's left behind true knowledge that he has forgotten or resisted and refuses to see anymore. So this is going to be, one of the underlying tensions in the novel as a whole. And this also relates to this problem of interpretation, where the text is asking, and really Anadas is even voicing this, how can something appear to be one way, but then actually be another? And the alder tree is the example of this. How can she appear to be beautiful, but then when he sees her from behind, he sees the rotted tree form instead of the beautiful woman form? So it really raises the question of what is real. How is our perception guiding our understanding of what is real? And that directly connects to this scene with the farmer, where Anadas starts to believe him and take his side and his position, and he, begins to forget fairyland. But then later he goes up to his window, he sees a young girl running, and looks out of the house, and this is deeper in that same chapter. As soon as I looked out the window, a gush of wonderment and longing flowed over my soul like the tide of a great sea. Fairyland lay before me and drew me towards it with an irresistible attraction. So he has sort of pushed aside all of his experiences of fairyland while he is in this house with the rationalist farmer. But then when he looks out the window, he realizes, wait, everything this farmer has said is actually only one piece of the picture, that there is this real fairyland out there. And I'm so, easily persuaded to forget those things, but that doesn't keep it from actually existing. So how can one thing appear to be real or appear to be one way, but actually be missing this big piece of information? And this is the deeper philosophical problem that's really guiding the novel. So one of the ways that MacDonald continues to emphasize this difference between the real and what is missing, and that is the fantasy experience or that imaginative experience for Anodos, is to narratively allude to things that he doesn't understand. So you'll see this repetition in different places, and I've just pulled a few of these. He says things like, soon a vague sense of discomfort possessed me. And then later, what I feared I could not tell. I can only try to describe something that it is not, but seems parallel to it, or is at least suggested by it. And he says again and again, I do not know how to describe it. There's this repetition of being unable to articulate or to say what things are or why he's being compelled to do certain things. And it's really this kind of purposeful failure of language on Anodos's part, where he's not doing it on purpose, but MacDonald is using him to purposely show the failure of language to be able to accurately describe everything. He's trying to show us how even when you're experiencing things in reality, you can't always make meaning of them. In this case, these are fantastical things that seem to exceed our known experience or our language, so that he can't describe them because there's nothing in his experience of the world and of his ability to use language that can really capture those things. So what you're going to have then is a text that, as Anodos is really struggling to tell us, the reader, because this text is written as if he's telling us from that first person point of view, then that keeps us a little bit removed from his full experience. And that can cause a little bit of discomfort as a reader because we want to understand. So in a sense, what MacDonald is doing is evoking or invoking in us a sense of desire for meaning, but then also pushing back on that and forcing us to not be able to have that meaning because our narrator is telling us that he can't tell us what it means, right? So it becomes really convoluted and really difficult to read sometimes because you're always being shown a character who can't really account for his own actions and can't even tell you necessarily exactly what he's seeing. But again, the reason MacDonald is doing this is because he wants to call attention to this slipperiness of the way that we make meaning, that it's not always an empirical, obvious, easy road to realism and to empiricism and to understanding everything, that there's actually a lot more gray areas in there that are difficult, and he wants to foreground those things as he's writing. So with this context in mind, we can look at the stories of the ash and the alder tree, or the episodes of the ash and the alder tree that he encounters, and really think about how his inability to make meaning or to understand or to be able to articulate even what his experiences are also keep him from being able to interpret or read the fantasy world around him, right? So I'm jumping from the idea of interpreting the actual text that we're reading into this interpretation of experience that he has with the ash tree and the alder tree. So the maiden of the alder tree tricks him, and he thinks that she's a beautiful woman, but in fact she is an evil tree that is offering him up to the ash tree who's trying to kill him. So he can't really read her, right? He can't understand how she could be beautiful but also evil. So he's kind of distressed by this, even more so than his own lack of wisdom. And he also doesn't pay attention to any warnings or apply any knowledge, for example, from the knight. He doesn't listen to the knight's story and then apply that to his own experience or watch out for that. Instead, he just kind of falls right into the same trap. So he's not really thinking through anything, and he's not interpreting anything, so he's just experiencing. So this is kind of the flip side. While the rational knowledge can inhibit our perception of fantasy, only living within the fantasy world and experiencing and not applying any rational knowledge is actually problematic too. So there is a problem on both sides, and really maybe the way through is meeting in the middle, right? Combining the two and being able to apply rationality to fantasy so that you can experience it with understanding, but then also not letting your rationality quench fantasy to the point where you can't see it or experience it at all anymore. So just keeping in mind that this episode of the ash tree or the alder tree tricking him in order to bring the ash tree to him is actually still dealing with a very similar issue of interpretation, not being able to read her, not being able to figure out her meaning and what she really is all about, and then having this awful encounter because he's not able to make meaning or interpret. Now, in the midst of these episodes with the trees, we also have the character of the White Lady. And Anodos sees her, finds her in a cave, and she's trapped in marble. And he decides that he's going to try to free her. And you'll see what he does is he tries to free her first, and this is in chapter 5, based on his knowledge of fantasy stories. So he says, numberless histories pass through my mind of change of substance from enchantment and other causes, and of imprisonment such as this before me. I thought of the prince of the enchanted city, half marble and half a living man, of Ariel, of Niobe, of the sleeping beauty in the wood, of the bleeding trees, and many other histories. And then he says, maybe I should kiss her, right? A kiss awoke the sleeping beauty. A kiss cannot reach her through encrusting alabaster. I kneeled, however, and kissed the pale coffin, but she slept on. I bethought me of Orpheus and the falling stones, that trees should follow his music. Seemed nothing surprising now. Might not a song awake this form, that the glory of motion might for a time displace the loveliness of rest? Sweet sounds can go where kisses may not enter. I sat and thought. So he's giving us his point of view here about how is he going to solve this problem of waking her up. And he's drawing on imaginative stories here. So trying to figure out how to solve it by looking to previous fantasy texts and then trying to interpret his current reality. And in fact, he turns out to be right. So again, we can ask ourselves, is this MacDonald making an argument that fantasy literature does contain knowledge that can be used in a real life situation? Again, here, fairyland is not a dream. This is real. So he is experiencing this. And he is kind of using or trying to use his knowledge to interpret what to do and to problem solve here. So he eventually sings something, and he's, again, not telling us exactly what he's saying, but he says, I sang something like this. But the words are only a dull representation of a state whose very elevation precluded the possibility of remembrance. So he's not even able to recreate for us exactly what he's saying, but it worked. So she comes to life with a cry and then disappears. And he essentially is going to spend a lot of the novel longing for her, trying to find her, trying to search for her. And this idea of this idealized love, that she's somehow this perfect love, is really going to push him more into that quest motif that I mentioned earlier. This quest for maturity is going to really begin with this encounter with the White Lady, and that he feels that he loves her, and he begins to idealize her, and then has to go through this process of learning to recognize what is and what is not true love. So that's kind of what part she's going to play as you continue to read. But I also want to tie this moment to the myth of Pygmalion, where art comes to life. Pygmalion, if you're familiar with the story, creates a statue. She comes to life. So I'm wondering if we could also ask the questions, what are the implications of this for the actual novel? Is this an argument about the potential for something real to emerge from the world of art? And I really think, knowing MacDonald's personal philosophies the way I do, that he would say yes to this, that for him, art has a spiritual reality that is missed by empirical, everyday scientific pursuits. That there's a spiritual reality that comes to life through this process of participating in art, whether that's through sculpture or singing or dancing or reading or creating anything, that you are creating some kind of spiritual reality, even if there's not an object to look at, right? So there may not be a product, but the participation in that process of creating art, in this case, Anodos's song is the art, actually produces something or awakens something that has a reality. So I think MacDonald, again, is asking us to think here about the implications of art, the philosophy behind art, and its connections to aesthetic experience, the way that fantasy also connects to aesthetic experience. Now we're going to see how some of these different philosophies play out throughout the rest of the novel, but this should give you some context for what's really at stake here, that there's a deep philosophical underpinning to the novel, even as it's meandering, even as it doesn't totally make sense, and even as it's intentionally resisting you as a reader by refusing to give you direct experience of the fantasy world. So with all of that context, I want to finish this week's lecture by just talking about the archetype of the shadow and the experience that Anodos has with acquiring his shadow in chapter 8. So this particular episode is actually one that had a lot of significance to another great British writer, C.S. Lewis. So if you're familiar with the Narnia Chronicles, and specifically with the book The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis actually read this novel and almost lifted this idea directly from MacDonald, which he acknowledges in his own writing, where Anodos goes and he looks into the closet and he sees this other world. This is the same, I guess, image that Lewis had in mind when he created the wardrobe, with the idea of opening a door and there being another world behind that someone could travel into. Now, even though Anodos does not, in fact, go through, that in fact the shadow comes out of that world into his fantasy world, that idea there really resonated with Lewis, and he ended up using that in his own writing. It has this episode within the context of the novel does have a pretty significant effect on Anodos and really kind of shapes quite a bit of what comes ahead. So I want us to just talk about that as we continue to read for next week. So this is towards the end of chapter 8. You'll remember that he goes into this house. He sees an old woman, and in the corner was a door, apparently of a cupboard in the wall, but which might lead to a room beyond. Still, the irresistible desire which had made me enter the building urged me. I must open that door and see what was beyond it. I approached and laid my hand on the rude latch. Then the woman spoke, but without lifting her head or looking at me. You had better not open that door. This was uttered quite quietly, and she went on with her reading, partly in silence, partly aloud, but both modes seemed equally intended for herself alone. The prohibition, however, only increased my desire to see, and as she took no further notice, I gently opened the door to its full width and looked in. So at first he thinks that it's a common closet, but I'm going to skip down. But as I looked, I saw that there were no shelves at the back, and that an empty space went in further, its termination appearing to be a faintly glimmering wall or curtain, somewhat less, however, than the width and height of the doorway where I stood. But as I continued looking for a few seconds toward this faintly luminous limit, my eyes came into true relation with their object. All at once, with such a shiver as when one is suddenly conscious of the presence of another in a room where he has for hours considered himself alone, I saw that the seemingly luminous extremity was a sky, as of night, beheld through the long perspective of a narrow, dark passage, through what, or built of what, I could not tell. So he suddenly realizes all at once that he's looking into this other world through the doorway. So he's going to see the stars glimmering, and then he says, but suddenly, as if it had been running fast from a far distance, for this very point, and had turned the corner without abating its swiftness, a dark figure sped into and along the passage from the blue opening at the remote end. I started back and shuddered, but kept looking, for I could not help it. On and on it came, with a speedy approach but delayed arrival, till at last, through the many gradations of approach, it seemed to come within the sphere of myself, rushed up to me and passed me into the cottage. All I could tell of its appearance was that it seemed to be a dark human figure. Its motion was entirely noiseless, and might be called a gliding, were it not that it appeared that of a runner, but with ghostly feet. I had moved back yet a little to let him pass me, and looked around after him instantly. I could not see him. "Where is he?" I said in some alarm to the woman who still sat reading. "There, on the floor behind you," she said, pointing with her arm half outstretched but not lifting her eyes. I turned and looked, but saw nothing. Then, with a feeling that there was yet something behind me, I looked around over my shoulder, and there on the ground lay a black shadow, the size of a man. It was so dark that I could see it in the dim light of the lamp, which shone full upon it, apparently without thinning at all the intensity of its hue. "I told you," said the woman, "you had better not look into that closet." "What is it?" I said, with a growing sense of horror. "It is only your shadow that has found you," she replied. "Everybody's shadow is ranging up and down looking for him. I believe you call it by a different name in your world. Yours has found you, as every person's is almost certain to do who looks into that closet, especially after meeting one in the forest, whom I dare say you have met." And then she lifts her eyes and her head to him, and he realizes that she is the ogre. So he is stuck with this shadow that has run out to meet him. And I think this contrast between his pathless search and then this idea that the shadow has been out looking for him is really sharp here and really intentional by MacDonald in terms of showing how his lack of maturity and his refusal to listen to any warnings and these kind of impulsive ways of being lead him to just kind of defiantly go into opening this door, and then he receives something that he can't get rid of. So typically the archetype of the shadow is supposed to reveal the aspects of a hero's personality that he does not recognize in himself. So this is a psychoanalytic theory that was developed by Carl Jung, and essentially what the shadow is supposed to be an extension of the self, a type of unconscious, and it's almost always negative. So Jung says the shadow personifies everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about himself. So it's those things that we push down, the things that we don't want to think about ourselves, the things that we refuse to engage with, that the shadow is that other self. So we have here Anodos kind of finding this other side of himself, if is another way for you to think of it. Now, of course, Jung in psychoanalytic theory was a whole 100 and something years after MacDonald writes this, so he's not aware of this, but he is drawing on these sort of archetypes that tend to exist within culture and within literature, and as Jung looks back and makes these or articulates these a little more, MacDonald can become an example of what he was talking about here. So it doesn't necessarily have to represent his unconscious. That wouldn't have been intentional by MacDonald. I think MacDonald's background within the church would probably align it more with the idea of original sin. So you can almost think of it like the Adam and Eve tale in the Judeo-Christian tradition of plucking the fruit from the tree and suddenly recognizing one's own nudity, again, a sense of shame or a sense of separation from an innocent perspective, that this is the same kind of thing that Anodos is experiencing, that he is compelled to look into the closet, won't think about the consequences, and then has to take on within himself and attach to himself something that is negative. So there's a similarity there that I think would probably be more aligned with MacDonald's intention, but with our postmodern and post-psychoanalytic world, we can also align this through the Jungian theory of the archetype of the shadow. So there's a lot happening in this moment. And the shadow is going to become this important character throughout the rest of the novel. So I want us to key in on what exactly the shadow is doing here. So what he does basically is take away the wonder of fairyland. Anytime that the shadow falls over any part of fairyland, it makes things ordinary. It takes away the fantasy elements of fairyland and makes them seem like they're just everyday elements. And it takes away the wonder. So you see Anodos discuss this when he says, since my visit to the Church of Darkness, my power of seeing the fairies of the higher orders had gradually diminished until it had almost ceased. But I could frequently believe in their presence while unable to see them. So he's saying, this is in chapter 10, ever since he went there and received his shadow, he's actually not able to see things as much anymore. He says, he kind of hates the shadow basically at first. He's kind of annoyed by it and wants to get rid of it. But then as time goes on, he actually begins to be proud of it and to feel that in some way that it's giving him knowledge and dispelling the fantasy in a way that will help him to not be taken in, right? That he says, like, I'm not going to believe in fairyland anymore because I can see that my shadow is actually showing me the truth. And he begins to grow proud of this. But again, as we've said, fairyland is real. So it's almost like the shadow is creating an illusion that it's portraying as reality, because it's asking Anodos to forget the fairyland and dispelling these sort of fantastical things, but those things are actually real. So I think the underlying critique becomes that MacDonald is actually critiquing rationalists who always walk around saying, oh, I don't believe in anything supernatural or fantastical. I'm so much smarter than everyone else. And MacDonald is almost suggesting here, well, yes, you found your shadow. It has actually tricked you. You are the one that's living in an illusion, not everyone else who believes in the reality of the fantastic. So again, it's a subversion and a reversal and a critique of the more empirical realist tradition, and really trying to prioritize fantasy as being primary, because again, I can't stress this enough, the fairyland here in this text is not the fairyland of Alice's Adventures of Wonderland. There's no, I wake up and it never happened. It is a real place and a real experience. So I think that, as I wind up for this week's lecture, what I want to leave you with is to think about this tension of the shadow that, as the quote here at the end of the slide says, through an encounter with the shadow, a person becomes aware of and often ashamed of those qualities and impulses he denies in himself but can plainly see in others. So the shadow has helped Anodos to become aware of those impulses that people have to dispel fantasy, to get rid of the imaginative aesthetic experience, and to only believe in the rationalists, which is what he was tempted to do before with the farmer. And then he had to be reminded when he looked out the window, oh yeah, fairyland is real. And now the shadow is permanently a manifestation all around him of trying to push back against the fantasy experience and to claim that those things are less true or not true at all. So this is going to be something that he wrestles with as he goes throughout the rest of his time in fairyland. Okay, so I hope that these things have given you some context. Again, I know it's a difficult text. It's really highly philosophical, but I just want you to wrestle with it, to think about it, and to, with this background and these kind of images and philosophies in mind, go forward and read the rest of the novel, and we'll continue talking about it. Thanks.